Trouble began at exactly 12 strokes of midnight, when the bells of Lochdub Kirk were still echoing across the frozen moor, and the last of the Hogmanay cheer hung thick in the air. Inside the front parlour of Fraser House, a toast had just been raised, crystal glasses lifted, whiskey catching the firelight when Mrs. Elspeth Fraser pitched forward without a sound, her glass shattering on the rug like a gunshot that came too late. By the time anyone thought to scream, she was already dead. It should have been simple. Elspeth Fraser was 72, wealthy, sharp-tongued and disliked enough to make a short list of enemies. Yet the scene stubbornly refused to make sense. The doors were locked from the inside, the windows sealed tight against the Highland cold. 6 guests had stood in a neat half-circle when the toast was made, all holding identical glasses poured from the same bottle. Everyone drank. Only Elspeth died. The village doctor, summoned through slush and sleet, shook his head and muttered about hearts and shocks, but even he did not sound convinced. Elspeth had been mid-sentence, mocking someone's pronunciation of Auld Lang Syne, when death took her. No clutching chest, no stagger, just a sudden collapse, as neat and final as a blown-out candle. By dawn the story had spread through Lochdub like a crack in ice. By mid-morning, Hamish Macbeth stood in the parlour, long-legged and mildly rumpled, staring down at the stained rug where the glass had broken. He looked less like a policeman than a man who had wandered in by mistake, but his pale eyes missed very little. "A midnight toast that kills only one person," Hamish said softly. "That's not an accident. That's theatre." He examined the table first. 6 glasses now washed and drying in the kitchen, an eager mistake made by a helpful niece. The bottle of whiskey stood empty, its label peeled and curling. Nothing unusual there. No bitter almond smell, no residue. If poison had been used, it was either swift and subtle or never in the drink at all. Hamish walked the room slowly, as though retracing the final seconds of Elspeth's life. Her chair was slightly pulled back, one leg resting on the edge of the rug. A small plate lay beside it, holding a single triangle of toast, barely touched. Not celebratory toast, but bread-thin, dry and browned almost to black. "Who made these?" Hamish asked. Her nephew shrugged. "Just toast," Elspeth insisted. Said it soaked up the whiskey. Hamish crouched and sniffed the air near the plate. Beneath the lingering smoke from the hearth was another smell, sharp, fleeting, almost medicinal. He lifted the toast carefully, noticing how the underside was darker than the top, blistered in an uneven way. Elspeth had not drunk more than the others. That much was clear, but she alone had eaten. The locked room, the shared drink, the lack of struggle, all of it pointed away from the obvious. Hamish straightened and looked at the guests, now pale and watchful in the morning light. Someone had planned this to look impossible, banking on confusion and superstition to bury the truth. Outside, the bells were silent now, the new year settling in like a held breath. Hamish Macbeth felt the familiar tightening behind his eyes, the quiet certainty that the clue everyone thought meaningless was the only honest thing in the room. A toast had been raised at midnight, but it was not the whiskey that killed her. Hamish asked for tea, not because he wanted it, but because kitchens made people careless. Kettles were filled and cups fetched. He lingered in the doorway, watching the guests drift apart like guilty thoughts. Grief sat oddly on them, too stiff on some, too theatrical on others. Only one woman, Morag Fraser, Elspeth's sister-in-law, had not moved from her chair. She stared at the hearth as if waiting for something else to fall dead. The constable from the neighbouring village arrived, notebook open, already convinced it was a natural death complicated by bad timing. He asked about Elspeth's heart, her temper, her age. Hamish let him talk. Routine had its place, and sometimes that place was keeping people busy while the truth slipped sideways. In the kitchen, Hamish examined the toaster. It was old, the sort with a stubborn lever and a habit of burning one side more than the other. Crumbs littered the tray, darker than they should have been. He slid it out and frowned. The smell was stronger here, sharp again, faint but unmistakable now that he was looking for it. "What did you put on the toast?" Hamish asked lightly. Morag looked up too quickly. "Butter. Just butter. No marmalade, no dripping, no oil." He smiled easy and unthreatening. "Of course not." Her hands twisted in her apron. Elspeth hated anything fancy. Hamish nodded and turned the toaster upside down. Something small rattled inside, refusing to fall free. He didn't force it. Instead, he set the toaster back as it was and made a note in his head to return later. Alone. Back in the parlour, he walked the same slow circuit again, this time watching faces instead of furniture. When he reached the window, he paused. Frost feathered the glass on the inside, thicker near the sill. Someone had opened it recently, just a crack, enough to let in cold air. Enough to cool something hot very quickly. "You felt faint before you fell, did you?" Hamish asked the niece who had stood closest to Elspeth. She shook her head. She laughed. That's what was so awful. One moment she was laughing. And you? Hamish turned to Morag. You didn't eat the toast. I'd already had some earlier, she said. Too fast again. Didn't fancy it. Hamish accepted that with a small nod. People lied most easily about food. The doctor returned with his bag, confirming what death had already declared. No sign of stroke, no heart failure obvious enough to be convincing. He mentioned poisoning, then dismissed it, pointing to the shared whiskey once more. Hamish watched Morag's shoulders relax at that. Outside, a dusting of snow had begun to fall, softening the world, erasing footprints that might have mattered. Hamish felt time tightening, not loosening. Whatever had been done cleanly, with care, and with confidence that no one would think to look twice at something so ordinary. He went back to the toaster, when no one was watching, and shook it gently. A small object finally slid free into his palm, no bigger than a coin, scorched black around the edges. It was a chemical heating disc, the sort meant to warm hands, altered and jammed into the metal belly of the toaster, where it did not belong. Hamish closed his fingers around it and looked toward the parlour, where Morag sat very still, listening too hard to a conversation she pretended not to hear. The picture was far from complete, but the first crack had appeared. Someone had known exactly where to put the heat, exactly when to apply it, and exactly who would eat the toast that soaked up more than whiskey. The midnight toast had not been a gesture. It had been a delivery. Hamish set the disc carefully on the table and returned to the parlour, letting the morning sunlight strike across its scorched edges. The guests had regrouped, still hovering, as if their discomfort were a physical presence. The constable, oblivious to the small object that could change everything, was busy recording statements in a brisk, methodical way. Hamish listened more than he spoke, letting their words slip past his awareness like threads he would later pull to unravel the tangle. The first to speak again was the nephew, Colin Fraser, a tall man with sharp eyes that seemed to dart inwards when he lied. "I didn't touch anything," he said firmly. "We all drank the whiskey. I barely noticed the toast." His tone was defensive, overemphasized in a way Hamish had learned to recognize long ago. People who said too little usually hid, but those who said too much often told the truth in what they avoided. Next was Morag, still pale but composed, hands folded neatly on her lap. "I'd already eaten," she repeated. Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed, but Hamish caught the flicker of something in her Riza's shadow crossing before it vanished. "I wasn't even near her when it happened." "The niece Fiona offered another version." Elspeth was making jokes. Everyone laughed. I didn't see anything wrong at all. One moment she lifted her glass, the next she fell. It was instant. Her gaze dropped to the floor, fidgeting with a hem, betraying an unease her words tried to mask. Hamish noted how she emphasized laughter, as if trying to make it sound impossible for anyone to plan such a death in those few seconds. Hamish asked lightly, "And no one touched the toast before she did?" "No!" Several voices chimed together. Hamish caught a hesitation in Morag's breath, a split-second pause she tried to cover with a polite cough. Nothing about the pause screamed guilt, but it demanded attention. Small silences had weight if you knew how to measure them. He moved toward the fireplace, letting the others watch him idly, as if their scrutiny could keep him from seeing the truth. Did anyone notice the toast itself? Anything unusual? His voice was casual, conversational, meant to make them forget he was probing. The room fell silent. Colin frowned. It was just toast. Fiona nodded. Just bread. Morag's fingers flexed in her lap, invisible to the others, and she murmured, "I thought it smelled odd, but I didn't say anything." Hamish made a mental note. Someone had noticed something but kept quiet. Fear, perhaps, or calculation. He paced slowly between them, watching expressions tighten and loosen like fishing lines in water. "And the window?" He said softly, "Any of you open it at all last night?" Silence again, heavy. Then Colin shifted uneasily. "And maybe just a crack, to let in the smoke from the fire. Nothing more." Hamish tilted his head, considering. The frost still clung to the glass. Only a careful opening could have left such a mark without disturbing the curtains. Someone was trying to appear helpful but gave away the truth in a single slip. He filed it away. He probed further with questions about seating, the precise timing of the toast, who poured the whiskey, who laughed first, and who glanced away from whom. Every answer seemed mundane, yet tiny contradictions emerged. One said she set her glass down before drinking. Another insisted she raised it last. One described laughter before the toast, another after. Nothing outright, but patterns that did not quite align. Hamish's gaze returned to Morag, sitting perfectly still now, almost statuesque. There was calm in her posture, but beneath it something strained, something that could unravel if pressed. Everyone else had volunteered the same story, eager to be helpful. She alone seemed careful, calculating. The voices of deception were not lies, yet they were hints, pauses, and subtle omissions. Hamish knew that in such silence, the real story waited, hidden between what was said and what was left unsaid. By the time the constable packed up, satisfied with official statements, Hamish stood quietly, listening. Every tiny slip, every hesitation, every overemphasized truth pointed to the next move. The crime had seemed impossible, but the faintest tremor of human error was now showing the first shadow of clarity. And shadows, Hamish knew, often led straight to the heart of the mystery. Hamish returned to the parlour after a short walk outside, the cold air sharpening his thoughts. The snow had begun to settle, smoothing over footprints and erasing traces of hurried movements, leaving only the faintest depressions where the guests had walked. Inside, the house smelled of smoke, burnt bread, and old wood, a comforting mixture, if one ignored its sinister undertones. He stood by the window for a moment, staring at the frost, letting the silence settle around him. A murder in a room full of people always left echoes. The trick was to know which ones to listen to. He began quietly mapping connections. Colin Fraser, the nephew, was heir to Elspeth's considerable estate. His polite eagerness to cooperate was just a little too sharp, a little too rehearsed. Hamish wondered how much of that eagerness was nervousness, and how much calculation. Morag, the sister-in-law, had lived in the house for decades, always under Elspeth's critical eye. She had a reputation for simmering resentment, the kind that never spilled into words but could easily spill into action. Fiona, the niece, seemed genuinely naive, but naivety could mask fear, and fear often hid deeper truths. Hamish leaned against the mantelpiece, watching as they shuffled in quiet discomfort. Money, legacy, reputation, old grievances, everyone had a reason. Yet none of these motives alone explained the precise mechanics of the death. Whoever had done it had known exactly how the toast would behave, exactly how Elspeth would react, and exactly who would eat first. The killer had been clever, calculating, and willing to exploit everyone else's assumptions. He asked Colin quietly, "Did you ever argue with your aunt about the estate?" Colin stiffened, then nodded once. "We disagreed. She could be harsh, very exacting." Hamish noted the word disagreed and how carefully Colin avoided saying anything more. He didn't want to admit anger, but neither did he want to lie outright. "Morag," Hamish said next. "You've lived here with her for years. Any quarrels lately?" Morag's calm eyes flickered, just enough to catch his attention. Elspeth could be difficult. "Yes, but I loved her. I would never—" Her voice trailed, and Hamish didn't press. Sometimes the silence spoke louder than any confession. Fiona twirled her apron nervously. She always joked about who would get what, but it was in fun. We never argued seriously. Her words were honest perhaps, but the emphasis on seriously suggested she'd noticed tension she wasn't ready to voice. Hamish began sketching the timeline in his mind. The fire lit, the whiskey poured, the toast toasted and buttered, everyone standing, the single fatal bite. Each moment was a thread, each reaction a knot in the larger fabric of human desire. Greed could push someone to act, but only if they had the knowledge to execute it perfectly. Revenge required patience and opportunity. Fear could silence witnesses. Jealousy could sharpen motives into action. He looked back at the scorched disc from the toaster, still resting on the table. Someone had tampered with it deliberately, exploiting Elspeth's habits and the trust of the room. Whoever had done it understood chemistry, or at least the reaction between heat and poison, and they had calculated timing to the second. That narrowed the list of suspects considerably, yet every person left had reason to want her dead. Hamish considered the relationships again, weighing proximity, resentment, and knowledge. Colin had the inheritance, Morag had the resentment, Fiona had the access and inexperience to be manipulated. But the trick, Hamish realised, was that this crime had not been driven by a single motive. It was a lattice of desires, overlapping intentions, and calculated opportunity. One motive alone could not explain the precision. It was greed married to cunning, jealousy tempered by patience, and a willingness to exploit the assumptions of everyone else. He let the thoughts settle, quiet and deliberate. To untangle the web, he would need more than evidence. He would need to watch reactions, catch the tiniest slips, the unguarded glances, the whispered admissions that passed in passing. The maze of motives was dense, but Hamish Macbeth knew that even the most tangled labyrinth had a centre, and he intended to find it before the killer could strike or hide again. Hamish's attention was drawn again to the scorched disc on the table, small and unassuming, yet holding more significance than anyone realized. By mid-afternoon, the constable had discovered residue on the toast crumbs in the kitchen bin, something chemical in nature, and he declared the case solved before anyone could think twice. "It's a simple matter of poison," he said, eyes alight with triumph. The toast was laced with a fast-acting substance, and the disc created the heat to activate it. Whoever handled that disc did it deliberately. Case closed. The family, relieved and eager for closure, breathed easier. Colin tried to appear casual but allowed a faint smile to escape, while Morag's shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly. Fiona's wide eyes followed Hamish as if seeking approval. The constable's confident pronouncement created the illusion of order, and Hamish allowed the others to bask in it, saying nothing, watching quietly. He wandered back to the fireplace, eyes tracing the minute details he had noted earlier. Something didn't fit. The disc explained the mechanism, yes, but not the choice of victim, the timing, or the carefully staged opportunity. The ease with which everyone had accepted the explanation bothered him. The truth presented by the authorities was neat and tidy, but Hamish had long learned that neatness was a comfort for those who did not look closely. He returned to the kitchen under the pretense of examining the toaster once more. As he lifted it, something almost invisible caught his eye, a faint scratch on the underside of the lever, as though it had been removed and replaced in a hurry. No one else had noticed it. The mark was deliberate, but not consistent with careless handling. It was a signature of calculation, of someone experienced in manipulation. The disc had been part of the plan, certainly, but the hand that inserted it had left this tiny clue a breadcrumb for anyone observant enough to see it. Back in the parlour, Hamish watched the guests with a quiet intensity. Colin leaned against the wall, trying too hard to seem relaxed. Morag's fingers flexed in her lap, subtle but deliberate. Fiona avoided eye contact altogether, letting her gaze wander to harmless corners of the room, all outwardly compliant, all inwardly engaged in some unspoken narrative. Hamish understood that the declaration of guilt or solution was more dangerous than helpful. A false sense of resolution would allow the true culprit to remain calm, to observe, and to act if necessary. He let them chatter among themselves for a while, listening to the stories that had already been told, the minor contradictions, the subtle pauses, the overemphasized truths all persisted. No one admitted to touching the disc or noticing its unusual warmth before the toast, and yet Hamish could feel the pulse of deception, faint but insistent, weaving its way through the conversation like smoke through cracks in a chimney. Hamish moved toward the window, resting his hand lightly on the sill where frost still clung, and thought about opportunity. Whoever had done this had known every habit, every preference, every predictable move of Elspeth Fraser. It was not merely a crime of chance, it was one of meticulous observation and planning. It meant the perpetrator was not only present but trusted, someone capable of moving unnoticed in plain sight, while ensuring the rest of the room followed the assumed narrative. As dusk began to settle over the snowy moor, casting long shadows into the parlour, Hamish realised that the early breakthrough was nothing more than a curtain hiding the stage. The disc, the toast, the chemical residual pieces of a story told too soon. The true villain remained in the shadows, calm, observing, patient. And Hamish Macbeth knew that, until that figure revealed themselves, the room would be charged with tension, every innocent gesture potentially hiding a dagger in disguise. The false victory of the authorities had not solved the mystery, it had merely stirred the pot, leaving the real killer free to manoeuvre, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. Hamish lingered in the parlour as the others drifted off to settle for the evening, leaving him alone with the lingering scent of smoke and burnt toast. His gaze fell on the scorched disc again, now resting innocently on the edge of the table, and he thought of patterns of repetition, of old habits, of histories that cast long shadows. Something about the case felt familiar, like a half-remembered conversation from years ago, an echo of mischief turned deadly. He wandered toward the small writing desk in the corner, where Elspeth had kept her ledgers and letters. Sorting through the papers, he discovered an envelope, yellowed at the edges, addressed in a careful, looping hand. Inside were notes from an old family dispute, decades past a quarrel over inheritance, petty grievances that had escalated quietly over the years. One line caught his eye. A mention of Morag's refusal to follow Elspeth's instructions during a summer festival, which had led to public embarrassment for her family. The resentment simmered, even after time had ostensibly healed the wounds. Hamish sat back and traced connections in his mind. Colin had motive in the present, yes, but the root of anger could easily lie deeper, in history and humiliation long remembered. Morag's presence in the house, so steady and calm on the surface, might be hiding decades of smouldering frustration. And Fiona, who seemed innocent, had been witness to all of it, absorbing tension and observing loyalties shifting silently over time. He realized that the crime was not only about inheritance or convenience, it was about a network of old grievances, unspoken humiliations, and buried rivalries that had silently accumulated. He remembered something from the village archives, a peculiar incident 25 years ago involving a similar toast at the Fraser House Hogmanay gathering, when Elspeth's youngest cousin had suffered a sudden illness after eating. The records were vague, almost dismissive of presumed allergy, the cause never investigated further. Hamish frowned. It was the kind of detail most people would forget, but not someone plotting carefully. History, he realized, had repeated itself, though this time with lethal precision. He returned to the scorched disc, turning it over in his hands. The device had been adapted with knowledge of past events someone had learned from history, and deliberately refined their method. That meant the killer had not only studied habits and preferences, but had also understood the consequences of prior mistakes, refining them into a foolproof plan. Hamish's thoughts shifted back to the family. Morag and Colin had lived under the same roof for decades, bound by etiquette, obligation, and old grudges. Their interactions had been subtle, filled with veiled rebukes and small acts of defiance. Fiona, though younger, had seen it all and understood the nuances. The threads of motive intertwined with the past, connecting each of them in a lattice of cause and effect. Elspeth's death was as much about settling old scores as it was about immediate gain. A creak in the floorboards drew Hamish's attention. He looked toward the hallway, empty, and smiled faintly to himself. The shadows of the past had been silent observers, waiting for the right moment to reveal their influence. The current crime was only the surface underneath. The patterns of history had guided action, shaped opportunity, and dictated timing. Hamish understood now that to solve the case, he had to read both the present and the past simultaneously, tracing the invisible lines that connected grudges old and new. The family's history was a map, and every sigh, glance, and hesitation in the parlour was a marker along it. In the quiet of Fraser House, Hamish Macbeth realised that understanding the shadows of the past might be the only way to illuminate the killer, hiding in plain sight, poised to strike again if overlooked. Hamish returned to the parlour the next morning, letting the soft grey light of dawn filter through the frost-fingered windows. He carried nothing but a small notebook and the weight of the previous day's discoveries. The room smelled faintly of wood smoke and burnt bread, reminders of the crime, yet he felt certain that the real evidence lay not in objects but in the human mind, the hesitation, the subtle glances, the words left unspoken. Can casually, pouring himself a cup of tea from a pot someone had left warming. "It's strange," he said, addressing the group without looking directly at anyone. "One toast, one bite, one death, and yet 6 people standing here. That's quite a coincidence, isn't it?" He sipped, slow, deliberate, letting the question hover in the air like a fine mist. No one responded immediately. The room stiffened, each person calculating whether he was speaking casually or with intent. Hamish moved to the hearth, kneeling to adjust the hearthstones with exaggerated care, watching their reactions out of the corner of his eye. "You know," he continued, "people often notice far more than they think. A smell, a sound, a small gesture, and yet they say nothing. They think their silence protects them, but sometimes it's exactly what betrays them." He let the words sink, then reached into his pocket and produced the scorched disc. He held it lightly between thumb and forefinger, turning it over so that all could see. "This," he said, "is a very clever piece of work, tiny, unassuming, but deadly in the right hands. I'm curious, who among us might have noticed it before the toast? Even for a second? Surely someone must have seen it, touched it, or at least wondered about it." There was a moment of tense quiet. Colin's posture remained rigid, Morag's fingers flexed again, and Fiona's gaze flitted to the floor. Hamish smiled faintly, leaning back slightly, letting the atmosphere press against them without accusation. "Even a lie leaves a mark," he murmured, almost to himself, though they all heard. Then Morag stirred, a barely perceptible movement, but enough. Her eyes darted toward the toaster on the counter, then back at Hamish, and she exhaled in a way that almost went unnoticed. I suppose I might have noticed something," she said softly, voice catching slightly, "but I didn't think it mattered. It was just a small disc, part of the toaster. Nothing unusual." Hamish's eyes narrowed gently, noting every inflection, every hesitation. "Ah," he said, smiling faintly. "So it mattered enough to observe, but not enough to mention. Interesting. That's often the way with small details, isn't it? Too insignificant to be worth mentioning, until they kill someone." Her hands tightened in her lap, and Hamish sensed the subtle shift, the imperceptible crack in her carefully maintained calm. Fiona shifted slightly, watching her aunt, and Colin's jaw tightened, though his face remained composed. By forcing Morag to confront what she thought inconsequential, Hamish had revealed an instinctive response, a hesitation she had not fully controlled. That tiny fracture, invisible to anyone else, confirmed that she knew more than she let on. Hamish placed the disc back on the table gently. "The truth," he said, voice low, "is rarely in the big gestures. It lives in the small ones, the glance, the breath, the hesitation. People can control their words, but not always their reactions." He took a slow sip of tea and leaned back, letting the moment hang. Morag's eyes, now wide and almost guilty, betrayed the unspoken knowledge she had tried to bury. The psychological test, subtle and unobtrusive, had done its work. The killer's mind, if observed carefully, could be revealed not through what they said, but through what they could not hide. Hamish smiled faintly to himself, knowing he was closer than ever to seeing the web of deception unravel. The house, quiet now except for the hiss of the dying fire, held its breath, and somewhere in that stillness, the person who had engineered the midnight toast was beginning to understand that the game had shifted and that Hamish Macbeth was finally seeing through the smoke and mirrors. Hamish left the parlour for a moment, carrying the scorched disc carefully in a small envelope, intending to examine it more thoroughly in his own space. The house was quiet, the faint creak of floorboards under his boots the only sound, and for a moment he allowed himself to think that progress was finally within reach. But when he returned 15 minutes later, a cold certainty prickled at the back of his neck. The disc was gone. The envelope lay crumpled on the edge of the table, empty, the flap torn. Hamish froze, eyes scanning the room. Colin was in the far corner, pretending to leaf through an old magazine. Fiona had her hands clasped tightly, staring out the window, and Morag sat perfectly still, almost statuesque, as if she hadn't moved in hours. The disc had vanished without a trace, leaving only the faintest smear of soot where it had been handled. Hamish didn't shout or accuse. He simply crouched and examined the remnants of the envelope. The tear was jagged, rushed, but deliberate someone had known precisely how to remove the evidence and leave it looking like an accident. Whoever had done this was not only aware of the disc's importance, but also willing to manipulate the scene while he was distracted. "Someone's in a hurry," he said quietly, almost to himself, or trying very hard to make me think so. He stood and surveyed the guests. Colin's hands fidgeted ever so slightly, betraying a nervous energy Hamish had not seen earlier. Morag's calm mask remained, but her fingers were flexing under the table, subtle enough to be unnoticed by anyone but a careful observer. Fiona's eyes were wide, almost fearful, but it was the tension in her jaw that caught his attention, a tell that suggested knowledge, if not guilt. Hamish walked slowly to the kitchen, lifting each small object, examining crumbs and fingerprints. Nothing. Whoever had taken the disc had done so cleanly, leaving almost no physical trace. But that in itself was a clue. Only someone confident, someone intimately familiar with the house and the investigation, could act so decisively without leaving evidence. The stakes had changed. What had been a case of observation and deduction was now a contest against a moving target. The real killer or their accomplice was watching, manoeuvring, anticipating each step. Hamish knew that the disappearance of the disc wasn't a panic, it was strategic. Whoever had taken it intended to bury the truth long enough for suspicion to shift elsewhere, to muddy the water, and exploit the false sense of victory already declared by the authorities. He returned to the parlour and let the guests settle into an uneasy silence. "It seems," he said softly, "that one of us has taken a piece of the story away. Whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing and when." No one spoke. The quiet pressed down like a heavy blanket, revealing more than words ever could. Hamish considered the timeline. The disc had been in his hands, unattended for only a short while, yet someone had seized the opportunity. That meant the culprit had not only observed the toast and the reaction, but had been following the investigation closely, calculating moments of vulnerability. The perpetrator was in plain sight, blending in, trusting that the illusion of normalcy would protect them. He let the thought settle, watching faces for the slightest reaction. Morag's eyes flicked toward the counter and back too quickly. Colin's gaze shifted as though seeking an escape route in the room, and Fiona's lips pressed together so tightly that it almost hurt to watch. Each movement was a ripple, betraying the careful control they tried to maintain. Hamish smiled faintly, his calm masking the urgency beneath. The vanishing of the disc had not stalled him, it had clarified the game. The killer's confidence was a weakness, and every subtle shift, every stolen object, every calculated distraction only revealed more about their character. The true danger was not in the loss of evidence, it was in the fact that the thief thought they were winning, and Hamish Macbeth had a long memory for those who underestimated him. Hamish had just returned to the kitchen to check the crumbs on the counter when a sharp scream cut through Fraser House, slicing the quiet like a knife. He dropped the small notebook he'd been carrying and bolted toward the parlour, his boots sliding slightly on the polished floor. The guests were already gathered at the doorway, pale and trembling, and in the centre of the room, Fiona was on the floor, gasping for breath, a thin trickle of blood running from a small wound at her temple. She had been struck, no more than a glancing blow, but enough to terrify everyone and to prove that the killer was still watching, still bold, and still several steps ahead. The blow had been precise, almost surgical, aimed not to kill but to send a message. Hamish knelt beside her, assessing the injury, noting how her hands shook and how the subtle bruise already formed beneath her skin. She had been targeted specifically, and it was no accident that the rest of the family had been drawn into shock. What happened? Colin demanded, voice tight with fear. Morag's calm composure faltered as she bent down to support Fiona. Hamish's gaze swept the room, noting everything: the slightly ajar window at the far end, the overturned chair near the sideboard, the absence of any sign of forced entry. It was the same pattern as the first crime, precise, controlled, executed from within. Fiona's lips trembled. I was just walking past the counter, and something hit me from behind. I didn't see who. She paused, swallowing hard, and added, I think they were watching you, Mr. Macbeth. They wanted to scare us or you. Hamish's mind raced. The stolen disc had been a warning now. A physical attack had confirmed it. Whoever was orchestrating these events had intimate knowledge of the house, of their movements, and of Hamish's methods. They were no longer content with subtle manipulation. They were escalating, forcing action, provoking fear, and testing reactions. He glanced at Morag and Colin. Both looked pale, frozen in the sudden chaos, yet Hamish noted how neither moved decisively to secure the room, how neither searched for the weapon, and how Colin's eyes flicked repeatedly toward the hallway. The small inconsistencies that had seemed minor before now carried a sharp edge. The killer's confidence was still strong, but cracks were beginning to show, small, almost imperceptible, yet there. Hamish pressed a hand gently on Fiona's shoulder. You're safe for now, he said, voice low but steady. Stay here. He rose and moved toward the kitchen again, scanning every corner, every doorway, every shadow. Whoever had attacked Fiona had entered silently, struck quickly, and vanished before anyone could react. The evidence of their presence was fleeting, as elusive as smoke, but Hamish's mind worked to reconstruct it. Timing, opportunity, the movement of bodies, et al. Had to be considered. He thought of the past incidents, the stolen disc, the precise use of the heated toast, the hidden grievances, the subtle psychological tests. Each had been a layer of the same plan, each a step toward the ultimate goal. And now, with a second act of violence, the plan had accelerated. The killer was no longer content with deception. They were forcing him to anticipate, to protect, and to act before the next strike. Hamish felt a surge of determination. The attack had been unexpected, but it had also revealed something crucial. The villain wanted him involved, wanted him to react, wanted the tension to fracture the carefully maintained facade of family and loyalty. Whoever it was, they were clever, patient, and ruthless, but they had underestimated one thing. Hamish Macbeth did not rely solely on evidence left behind. He watched patterns, he read hesitation, and he understood human nature. The room was quiet again, Fiona trembling in Morag's arms, Colin stiff at the far wall. Hamish stood in the centre, his eyes sweeping the shadows, feeling the pulse of the house, the rhythm of opportunity, and the scent of danger. The case had changed. It was no longer only about solving a crime, it was about preventing the next one, and Hamish knew that the true test had only just begun. The midnight toast had killed once. If he was wrong again, someone else might not survive. Hamish paced slowly through the parlour, eyes flicking over every detail. He had already catalogued: the scorched hearth, the frost-framed windows, the uneven chairs, the crumbs scattered near the counter. Fiona sat quietly now, pale and frightened, while Morag tried to offer comfort without drawing attention to herself. Colin remained stiff, shifting occasionally, his gaze moving between doorways as though measuring escape routes. The house hummed with the low tension of unspoken fear, but to Hamish it was alive with information. He paused at the sideboard, where a small silver tray had been left from the previous night's festivities. A half-empty decanter, a few glasses, and a small pile of napkins. Most of it seemed trivial routine in a household accustomed to entertaining, but then his eyes caught the tiniest detail: a single napkin, folded carelessly, pushed slightly aside. It had been overlooked before, resting near the edge of the tray, yet something about the crease, the angle, seemed deliberate. Hamish crouched and studied it. The napkin had a faint smudge of soot, the same residue as the scorched disc. It was subtle, almost invisible, but in a house like Fraser's, small things were never random. He realised that the napkin had been moved perhaps during the preparation of the toast, perhaps in the moments immediately before the attack on Fiona, but its displacement was intentional. Someone had been testing the placement of objects, watching reactions, noting which items drew attention and which did not. He straightened, a thought forming like frost across glass. The sequence of events, the heated toast, the stolen disc, the subtle psychological probing. The attack was not chaotic at all. It was a rehearsal in miniature, each step designed to observe, measure, and manipulate. And the napkin was the keystone, a small but telling indicator of control. Whoever had orchestrated this had been using ordinary objects as instruments, not weapons, to gauge the responses of everyone in the room. Hamish's gaze swept the faces of the others. Morag's composure, Colin's nervous energy, Fiona's fear, all of them had been monitored, tested, and catalogued in subtle ways that had seemed insignificant at the time. And yet the pattern was clear now. The killer had relied on these tiny observations to refine their method, to ensure the deadly toast would succeed, and to anticipate reactions when the disc disappeared and the attack occurred. He moved deliberately to the kitchen, retracing the steps he had already taken, noting where each person had been, what they had touched, and how they had behaved. Everything aligned. Each minor deviation, each hesitation, each glance, all of it fell into place as part of a carefully orchestrated experiment. The villain had not acted randomly, they had acted with precision, shaping events, observing the results, and adjusting strategy in real time. Hamish smiled faintly. The key had been in plain sight all along, not in elaborate schemes or hidden compartments, but in the smallest details. A smudged napkin, a slight pause, a subtle glance. These were the fingerprints of human behaviour, patterns left unconsciously by the one who wielded them. The villain had counted on others, dismissing the minor, the mundane, as irrelevant. But Hamish Macbeth had always known better. The smallest things often carried the greatest weight. He returned to the parlour and watched, quietly, as Morag adjusted Fiona's shawl and Colin stared at the floor. He understood now that every seemingly trivial action, every minor object, was part of the same design, the pattern that had remained invisible until someone patient, observant, and sceptical pieced it together. The next steps were clear. Hamish had to follow the pattern, anticipate the killer's next move, and intercept it before another life was claimed. The game was no longer a puzzle to solve after the fact, it was a challenge to prevent, and the smallest detail might yet save the next victim. Hamish sat quietly in the parlour as twilight crept through the frost-laced windows, the soft glow of the fire casting long, wavering shadows across the floor. He had traced the pattern of the crimes, observed reactions, and noted each subtle deviation, yet something still nagged at the edges of his mind, a motive beyond the obvious grievances of inheritance or grudges. He needed the reason that explained not just the method, but the obsessive care, the theatrical cruelty, and the calculated escalation. He let the room settle into stillness, watching Morag adjust Fiona's shawl with meticulous care, Colin pacing in measured steps, and Fiona herself clinging to the edge of the settee, her eyes wide with lingering fear. Hamish's gaze returned to Morag. There was a tension in her hands, in the flexing of her fingers, that betrayed a mind constantly controlling and calculating. Yet it was more than that. Beneath the composure, there was a gleam of satisfaction, the subtle echo of someone who relished mastery over others. "You've been very careful," Hamish said softly, addressing no one in particular, measuring reactions, observing habits, adjusting for errors, and yet, even with all that control, something drives you beyond simple gain or resentment. Am I right? Morag's lips tightened, a faint tremor running through her jaw. She kept her eyes fixed on Fiona, but Hamish could see the hesitation, the invisible fissure in her calm. Colin stiffened, glancing toward his aunt, but Hamish ignored him for now. I don't understand what you mean," Morag said, voice steady but strained. Her hands gripped Fiona's shawl a fraction too tightly. Hamish leaned forward slightly. "Control isn't enough. Planning isn't enough. You wanted more than revenge or money. You wanted to prove something, to prove that no one could outthink you, that even those closest to you would bend to your design, knowingly or unknowingly." The flicker in her eyes betrayed a thought she could not suppress. She turned just enough for Hamish to see it, a shadow of triumph buried beneath the fear. "You enjoyed it," he continued gently, "the precision, the manipulation, the anticipation. The midnight toast was never about the whiskey, and the disc was never just an object. Every small act was a test not only of others, but of yourself. You needed to demonstrate your power, to orchestrate, to control events down to the smallest detail. And when it escalated to the attack on Fiona, that wasn't an accident. It was a way to assert your superiority, to watch how fear rippled through the room, to confirm the pattern you had created. Morag's composure broke, just a little, her fingers unclenching and trembling. I had to, she whispered. She humiliated me once, long ago, when no one noticed. I lived with it every day, and then I realized I could show that I was always the one in charge, that I could make them follow, make them act, make them respond. Hamish nodded, quietly, letting the confession hang in the air. It wasn't greed, it wasn't inheritance. It wasn't petty revenge. It was an obsession with mastery and almost pathological need to manipulate, to orchestrate life itself like a conductor guiding an unseen orchestra. That compulsion explained every minute detail, the careful placement of the disc, the timing of the toast, the theft of evidence, the attack on Fiona. Every act was a step in a ritual of control. Colin's jaw tightened, and Fiona shivered slightly, but Hamish held up a hand. Understanding this, he said, is the key. You weren't just killing or threatening, you were performing. And the pattern, the psychology, and the small details were your instruments. Once you see that, the rest becomes clear why the crime was executed with such care, and why anyone so clever could still leave traces that an observer would notice. Morag lowered her gaze, silent now, the tension draining as her motive was exposed in its raw, astonishing truth. Hamish leaned back, eyes calm, understanding at last that the danger had never been purely physical, it had been psychological, rooted in a mind driven by the need to dominate, to choreograph, and to prove that no one could ever see them coming. And in that understanding lay the only way to finally bring the Midnight Toast Killer to justice. Hamish had just finished ensuring that Morag was safely restrained, and that the authorities were on their way to take her statements when a sudden noise from the hallway made him pause, a muted thump, followed by the faint scrape of metal against wood. He spun toward the sound, heart quickening not with fear, but with the acute awareness that the case, as neat as it seemed, might not yet be finished. Colin and Fiona looked up, startled. "What now?" Colin muttered, but Hamish didn't answer. His eyes swept the corridor, landing on a slight movement near the coat rack. A shadow separated from the wall, and Hamish's gaze narrowed. It wasn't Moragate, it was someone else entirely. The butler, old Angus Mackenzie, usually a quiet observer, now standing with a tray in his hands, shaking slightly. On it, hidden beneath a napkin, was another scorched disc, identical to the one that had been stolen. "Angus?" Hamish said calmly, stepping forward. The man's eyes darted, and he set the tray down with a faint clatter. "I found it," Angus stammered. "I don't know why it was hidden, His voice trailed, faltering under Hamish's steady stare. Hamish crouched, examining the disc. It was pristine, untouched by the earlier tampering. And then the realization struck him, a final, subtle piece he had overlooked. The first disc, the manipulated toast, the psychological tests, the attack on Fiona. Even Morag's confession, it all fit together perfectly. Except for one thing. Someone had ensured a second disc existed. Someone had prepared a backup, an insurance policy, a contingency that would allow the scheme to continue even if Morag faltered. "You were part of this all along," Hamish said softly, his voice carrying the weight of quiet certainty. "Not just a bystander, Angus. You set things in motion, observed reactions, ensured the pieces fell into place. Morag executed the plan, yes, but you provided the safety net and the opportunity for escalation." The old man's hands trembled, and he lowered his gaze. "I didn't mean, she said it was necessary. It had to work," he muttered. "I didn't touch anyone. I just helped it happen." Hamish rose slowly, his mind tracing the timeline once more. Morag had been the visible orchestrator, driven by her obsession with control and precision. But Angus had been the hidden mastermind, manipulating events from the wings, providing access, removing or replacing evidence, and ensuring that the sequence could unfold exactly as planned. Without him, Morag could not have acted with such certainty. The backup disc, the precise opportunity to attack Fiona, even the subtle placement of objects, all of it, bore his quiet fingerprint. Colin stepped forward, confusion and fear in his eyes. But why? Why involve him? Why risk everything? Hamish looked at the older man, steady, unflinching. Because control alone was not enough for Morag. She needed an accomplice she could trust. Someone invisible, someone who could orchestrate events without drawing suspicion. "That is your role, Angus." You were not the one with the motive of personal vengeance or pride, but you became the enabler, the silent hand guiding the pattern. Without your participation, the plan could never have escalated to its full design. Angus's shoulders slumped, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. I only wanted to see it done right, he whispered. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. Hamish's eyes softened just a fraction, but his mind remained sharp. The case was no longer simply about Morag's obsession or her need for control. It was about a dual conspiracy, one visible and one hidden, the combination of which had allowed events to spiral from a peculiar midnight toast to attempted murder. The final twist was almost elegant in its cruelty. The real mastermind had been hiding in plain sight, blending servitude with calculation, and only Hamish's patient observation and attention to the tiniest deviations had uncovered the full truth. The room was silent, heavy with shock and comprehension, as Hamish stood in the centre, aware that the final act had not only revealed the unexpected accomplice, but had also tested his own skill to its utmost limit. The midnight toast had killed, but it had also unveiled the dark ingenuity of two minds working together, and Hamish Macbeth, as always, had seen through the smoke. Hamish watched as the authorities arrived at Fraser House, their coats brushing against the frosted doorway, boots crunching in the snow. Morag was led away, her composure returning just enough to mask the tremor in her hands, while Angus followed quietly, shoulders slumped, accepting his role in the unravelling drama. The family gathered in the parlour, relief and lingering tension mingling in their expressions. Yet Hamish remained in the centre, calm, the quiet eye in the storm, knowing that the truth, finally revealed, had layers many would never fully grasp. He addressed the family, his voice steady, measured. The midnight toast was more than an accident, more than a simple act of revenge or ambition. Every detail from the scorched disc to the minor psychological tests, from the seemingly insignificant placement of napkins to the attack on Fiona was part of a deliberate sequence. The first disc, the one you saw destroyed, was a test, a rehearsal. The second disc, hidden by Angus, was a safeguard, ensuring that the plan could continue even if initial steps faltered. Colin shifted in his seat, eyes wide. But how did you know? How could you see all of it? Hamish smiled faintly. It's rarely in the grand gestures where the truth lies. It's in the smallest movements, the hesitation before a word, the direction of a glance, the pressure in a hand, the way someone handles what they think is mundane. Morag's obsession with control drove her to orchestrate every event meticulously, but she needed a partner, someone invisible. Angus. He provided access, manipulated the timing, and ensured that even a misstep wouldn't prevent her design from unfolding. He turned toward Morag and Angus, now under careful watch. The clues were subtle, easily missed. The slight scratch on the toaster lever, the displaced napkin with its faint soot mark, the small inconsistencies in stories and gestures, the way attention shifted at crucial moments. Each of these signals pointed not just to who acted, but to why they acted, the combination of pride, obsession and compulsion to control. Observing reactions and connecting them with these details was the key to revealing the hidden pattern. Fiona exhaled softly, still trembling but safe. Colin remained silent, absorbing the scope of manipulation. Even in relief, there was a residue of unease, the realization that for weeks, the invisible hands of the killers had guided every movement in the house, and they had nearly succeeded. Hamish's gaze lingered on Angus for a moment. You were careful, quiet, patient. You believed that obedience to Morag's plan would absolve you. But in the end, your participation, however unintentional in harm, made you complicit. That is why understanding every nuance of human behavior is vital, not merely the actions themselves, but the psychology that underpins them. He paused, letting the words settle, then stepped back, surveying the room. Justice has been delivered in the sense that the truth is known, the perpetrators are accounted for, and no one else will fall victim. Yet justice is never perfect. There are motives buried in obsession, resentments simmered over decades, and lives touched by manipulation. That is the world we navigate, and it is why we must always observe carefully, question assumptions, and read the patterns others miss. The officers escorted Morag and Angus toward their carriage, the crunch of snow under wheels fading into the distance. Hamish stood in the parlour, alone for a moment, eyes sweeping the room. The scorched hearth, the frost-laced windows, the overturned chair, they were reminders of how easily appearances could deceive, how fragile security could be, and how deeply human psychology could shape events. He let a faint smile touch his lips, not of triumph, but of quiet satisfaction. The midnight toast had revealed not only a lethal plot, but also the subtle artistry of calculation and compulsion. And once again, Hamish Macbeth had seen through the shadows, traced the invisible lines, and remained one step ahead. Yet, as he looked out toward the dark moor, he could not help but sense that in every solved case, some secrets linger soft echoes in the snow, reminders that in the quiet corners of human ambition, danger could always rise again. Hamish stepped out into the crisp night air, the moor stretching wide and silent under the frost-laden sky. The carriage carrying Morag and Angus had already disappeared down the winding lane, leaving only the faint crunch of snow under its wheels. The house behind him was quiet now, its windows dark except for the faint reflection of moonlight on the frost, and yet he felt no relief, only the familiar hum of curiosity, the subtle tug that always warned him that a story never truly ends. He paused at the edge of the path, glancing back at Fraser House. Everything seemed settled, the perpetrators accounted for, the immediate danger removed. And yet, his mind replayed the day's events like a film, noting small fragments that had seemed unimportant at the time. A shadow flickering at the corner of the kitchen, a faint scuff on the floor near the sideboard, the way Fiona had hesitated for just a moment before answering his question about the scorched disc. Each was trivial in isolation, but together they whispered of an incomplete picture, of details that might still conceal secrets. Hamish adjusted his coat against the biting wind and thought of the second disc, hidden by Angus. Why had it been placed so carefully, so deliberately, yet almost overlooked in the chaos? It had allowed the plan to continue even after the first misstep, a failsafe designed with foresight. And who else had been watching that night? Were there eyes he hadn't noticed? Perhaps someone who had anticipated even his meticulous attention to detail. The thought was unsettling, yet thrilling the more seemed larger, more mysterious, as if each shadow might conceal another puzzle waiting to be unravelled. As he walked slowly down the lane, footprints crunching faintly in the snow behind him, a subtle chill ran through the air, more than the cold alone. A piece of paper, barely visible against the white frost, caught his eye. He stooped and picked it up, brushing off the snow. The message was brief, almost cryptic, written in a hurried hand. Patterns are never complete. Watch the hearth. Hamish's eyes narrowed and a faint smile touched his lips. The hearth, the same fireplace that had concealed clues in plain sight, that had hosted the sequence of events leading to the midnight toast, had been mentioned again, deliberately, almost tauntingly. Someone was still thinking, still testing, still leaving breadcrumbs in plain sight. The message was not a threat, it was an invitation, a reminder that the game was far from over. He pocketed the note and looked up at the sky, where the moon shimmered silver-white over the undulating moor. The night was still, the air crisp, and yet the possibilities were endless. Hamish Macbeth knew that justice had been served, but he also knew that curiosity and caution must never rest. For every puzzle solved, there were threads left dangling, questions unanswered, and eyes watching silently from the shadows. A crow cawed from the distant tree line, breaking the silence, and Hamish chuckled softly to himself. The moor, the frost, the quiet village beyond it all held stories, some buried, some whispered, some waiting to explode into chaos once more. He adjusted his collar, began the slow walk back toward the village, and allowed himself a single thought. Every ending was just a pause before the next mystery, and somewhere, in the flicker of shadows at Fraser House, or beyond the reach of the moonlight, the game continued, waiting for the patient, observant detective who could see the patterns others missed. Hamish Macbeth walked on, footsteps fading into the snow, already thinking ahead, already aware that the next secret was only a breath away. The night was silent, but the moor had stories yet to tell, and he would hear them all.